now.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, this is the last lecture of Onomastics Online in this semester. I'm very happy that so many researchers joined us, and I think that the talks could demonstrate the importance and the interdisciplinary nature of dealing with names. We had excellent speakers from different scientific fields, geography, anthropology, and lexicography. With today's talk, we return to kind of hardcore onomastics, the theoretical questions of names and name usage. The speaker is Richard Coates, and the chair of this event is Carol Half. Thank you very much, Richard and Carol, for accepting our invitation. I don't think I need to tell anything more. I just wish a wonderful time for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Huff, Professor of Onomastics at the University of Glasgow, of which you can see a panoramic view in my virtual background. I'm sure we are indeed going to have a wonderful time. It's a real honour and delight to introduce Richard Coates, Professor Emeritus of Onomastics at the University of the West of England, and, as many of you will know, a former Secretary and Vice President of ICOS. When I was asked to chair this lecture in the ICOS series, it struck me that it could be on practically any aspect of name studies, because Richard is a sort of onomastic polymath with genuine world-leading expertise in names of all kinds. I first got to know him as a place name expert, honorary director of the English Place Name Survey, and author of many major publications in the field, from his books on the place names of Hampshire, the Channel Islands, Rottingdean and Ovingdean, to articles offering important reinterpretations of individual names like London or Fettler, recurrent name types like Finkel Street or Maiden Castle, or common place name elements like Old English box or Middle English bad. However, he has also been responsible for some of the most stunning recent work on surnames as principal investigator of the Family Names of the United Kingdom project, which was awarded the best part of £1 million in funding by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and which produced the magnificent 4-volume Oxford Dictionary of Family Names in Britain and Ireland. Alongside all this, Richard has published on many other types of names, including those given to horses, locomotives, fishing trawlers, and so on. All of this vast range of knowledge comes together in his work on onomastic theory, culminating in what he has designated the Pragmatic Theory of Properhood. We had a trailer for this at the last talk in this online series, where Kimberly Classen's superb lecture on the lexical load of proper names for second language readers of English included a section on million views of proper names and different interpretations of Frege's sense in names, and flagged up Richard's talk on the topic today. That was on the 11th of April, so we've had over a month to look forward to it since then. And the great moment has now arrived. Over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Carol. You've given me a rather lot to live up to, I think. First of all, an apology for not having a panoramic view of Bristol to offer you in my background. All you have is a set of library shelves. And one thing that my screen that you probably can't see tells me is that there is a thunderstorm on the way. But I'm hoping that I'll still be audible above the thunderstorm. Okay, well, there you have my title slide, the Pragmatic Theory of Properhood. I've taken to abbreviating it to TPTP. That won't cause too many problems. This was the abstract that oops, what's happened? There you go, sorry. There's some very strange things happening. Okay, my abstract has already been circulated. I've said that the lecture, a kind of basic guide to theory of names that I've been working on for some time. If it's a basic guide, I hope I won't upset too many people by making it too basic. As you can see, the first section I want to speak to is about defining key term semantics. No doubt for some of this will be very, very easy stuff, and I will ask you to be patient for a while. I've put this in and put it in every time I speak on this topic because there are so many different traditions which use these terms in similar, different, or part overlapping ways. So I think I need to be absolutely certain that I get them understood in the right way by my audience. The key terms will be reference, denotation, and sense, as you will see. The rest of the talk is set out there. Why I think new approach in name theory is needed. New is in inverted commas, because of course one always stands on the shoulders of giants, and there are only certain aspects of what I'm going to talk about that I think are truly new. Some very familiar ideas will be floated. It's just that many traditional ideas are actually either wrong or misleading, as I hope to say in the course of the talk, as reflected in point 3, where TPTP differs from other approaches. Naturally, when one's forward new ideas, sometimes they're misunderstood by the community. So occasionally, some people have got hold of the wrong end of the stick, as we say in English. So number 4, I'll say a little bit about that. I'll then try to give a kind of honest assessment in 5 and 6 about where I think TPTP might be useful or constructive, and also a possible weakness in the theory, which I hope, Joe, will turn out to be a strength if you look at it with the right pair of spectacles on. Just very briefly, of course, when I use the word name in this talk, I always mean a proper name, as is proper for onomasticians. Okay, so on with my key terms. First of all, reference, which I use following the usage of the English linguist John Lyons to mean the act picking out an individual, the referent in some context. Referent is a matter of usage and belongs to the linguistic domain of pragmatics. Denotation is the set of potential referents, also known as denotata, of some lexeme or name. This is about one's cognitive capacity or memory, belongs in psycholinguistics and semantics in a sense rather than pragmatics, since it's about the theoretical abilities that attend the use of a particular word or name. The sense term, this may upset Frege in some ways. The sense of a term is a network of lexical relations such as synonymy, hyponymy, and so forth, that a lexeme enjoys. And as you will see as the talk progresses, this is something I think names do not possess. I can't say anything about connotation, which is, I think, sort of outside the domain of linguistics proper, though it's certainly part of onomastics. Connotation is about various sorts of associations that a word or name has with a whole range of things, persons, cultures, beliefs, and so forth.
Excuse me, may I just check that you're showing us the slide, the version of the slides that you intended us to be looking at? We're seeing your slides, but with the others down the left. I wondered if you intended to
I can't. I talked about this with Lasse beforehand.
I'm sorry.
There's nothing
Apologies.
I can do at the same time as.
Apologies.
I can't remove it without moving my notes as well.
Yeah, my
down
apologies.
at the bottom of the screen. Yes, it is correct, but don't look at the left if it's causing you eyesight problems. Okay, so I need to say something about why I think we need a heavy inverted commas approach to naming. I'm not going to talk about other individual theories because I've discussed the relationship to previous literature in various places in articles I've published. So I'm going to talk against the combined essence of a number of different related approaches, all of which share some similarities, all of which in particular share the similarities of making some false or misleading claims. One of those is that expressions are inherently either proper or common. In other words, if I present you with a string of letters on a page, you should be able to allocate it to the category of either word or the category of name. In other words, that properhood is a structural linguistic category. As you'll see, I think this is misleading and perhaps even false. Another traditional idea is that names are word for unique individuals. I think that's problematic in a number of ways. Firstly, and most obviously, because names may consist of more than one word. And secondly, it depends very much what you mean by for, whether this is a matter of reference or denotation, and I'll come back to that. The third thing that I hope to have time to deal with, but may have to pull out of if time runs short, is the idea that names fall into categories. In other words, that names are place names, personal names, and so forth. In a rather strange sort of way, I will to claim that this isn't true, or at least it's misleading, even if it's not fully untrue. Okay. The other key idea, which I've inherited from traditional literature, is that names lack sense. This is the one that I think is true. It's true, but it's problematic within existing approaches. For example, if place names have etymological sense, in other words, they come from expressions which were once fully meaningful in the language, how do they lose it? Just to take a very simple example, the name of London was presumably once meaningful within a language within which it, no, let's not use that example. Let's take Birmingham. Birmingham was originally meaningful in English. It's no longer meaningful in the conventional sense in English, in the sense of having sense. So how did it lose it? To become a name in my book is to lose sense. That's the essence of becoming a name, but does not mean that names are meaningless, as the occasional critic of mine has accused me of believing. Okay, as I said, rather than giving references to the huge literature on this matter, which is the oldest theoretical problem in linguistics, I think goes back 2,500 years or so, I just want to highlight the problems that I persistently offer difficulties, then offer a snapshot of what I think a comprehensive theory of names might look like. Going in at the deep end then, I want to focus first of all on what I think is the fully true key idea inherited from the work of John Stuart Mill in the first half of the 19th century. The idea, although he didn't express it in this way, is that proper names have no sense, that proper names have nothing equivalent to legal relations with other names. This isn't an idea that's original in itself, therefore, but what I've done is refocused it and made it consistent. The idea has some corollaries. One is that any expression which lacks sense is a name, which might be reformulated in mechanistic sounding terms as the idea that the default interpretation of any linguistic string is as a name. In other words, if you see something that you can't interpret, your first instinct is likely to be to ask yourself, is it a name? And so what of? Well, you can decide for yourself whether that's true at an individual level. The partly true key ideas, or misleading ones, that I drew attention to a few slides ago, is the idea that proper names are words for individuals. What I want to argue is that in a sense that is true, but that it's not a matter of denotation. Just to take an obvious case to which I'll return, Richard is not a word for a single individual, many people who share my name. But when conversation is taking place, then someone refers to Richard in a conversational context, which includes me, they are likely to mean me. And in that sense, referentially, Richard will be a word for me referentially, even if not uniquely denotationally. So I want to say that this foundation idea about names is that they're grounded not in an existential or cognitive state, somewhere deep in the brain, but in human activity. I also want to argue, as I already hinted, that properhood is not a structural category, but derived from referential properhood, and therefore not very interesting. I'll say more about that later, but it's just to get your gastric juices working on the idea, in the hope that you'll be receptive to it later on. Let's get down to basics then. What about the idea that names are senseless? Is it true? If names are senseless, and forgive me for sticking with English examples, because that's the way this lecture has been framed. Apologies for that if you don't like the idea. But if names are senseless, why do so many, even if they're simple and undisputed, appear transparently to have semantic content? The place name, Newcastle, the country name, Iceland, the female given name, Daisy, the surname, Coulson, all of these look entirely transparent. Let's just take Newcastle as the example. It's the name of several places in England. Just to focus on the best and the most famous one, Newcastle on Tyne. If I say I live in Newcastle, what do? I simply assert that I live in a place that you can identify. I do not assert that the place is a castle or that it's new. Those things have to do with its etymology, that is, the recoverable diachronic meaning, the meaning that it once had, not the sense that it once had, not the sense that it now has. Its etymology has no necessary bearing on what it notes, because the city, Newcastle upon Tyne, isn't a castle. It's named from a castle by metonymy, but when we use the Newcastle, when we use the name Newcastle in ordinary conversation, we don't have to mentally reverse that historical metonymy in order to get at what term is actually referring to in that conversational context. What about something really transparent like the University of the West of England? That undoubtedly a name that's been selected and bestowed upon a particular institution, and its etymology is transparent. Well, surely that makes sense. No, I don't think it does. Let me reason why. If I say I live in a house on the west of town, I can't say that without actually asserting at the same time that what I live in is a house and that it's on the west side of town. But if I say I work at the University of the West of England, I don't have to assert anything comparable. I don't even assert that I work at a university, because not everything that is called a university by name, is a university. There's an institution in Britain called University of the Third Age, which is essentially a kind of intellectual club for retired people. Conversely, there's no requirement for universities to actually have the word university in their name or title. The most famous one in an English-speaking context is probably Trinity College Dublin, which is a university in Ireland, or London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is also a university, but again, doesn't have the word university in its title. If a name has a transparent a name with a transparent generic term, like university in it, this gives a reasonable expectation, a probabilistic expectation of what the named thing is, but it doesn't give logical certainty about it. And given that sense as a linguistic and logical concept depends on logic certainty, we're clearly not dealing with a matter of sense unless we redefine sense, meaning something like probable type of denotatum. Now, that's not going to work because I've not seen a dog defined by any logician or linguist as a probably barking probable quadruped, for example. A dog is a quadruped that barks, and that's that. You don't get a comparable amount of certainty with a name, even if the name has a transparent generic like university in its title. So let's try a different take on these possible sense of names if you're wedded to the idea that they have sense. Many scholars believe that names have a categorical sense. In fact, this is an idea, for example, that Willy van Langendonk espouses explicitly in his book of 2007, and many others do. Sometimes people believe that they categorical sense because of their linguistic form, but not necessarily so. But in any case, people are prepared to identify Mary, for example, as a female given name, and that Mary is something which belongs to a category with that title. Austria, similarly, is a country or state name, and that the former massive British industry of Imperial Chemical Industries Limited is clearly a business name. The idea that such categories exist is the stock in trade of the terminology group of ICOS. If you go to the ICOS web page of the terminological group, you'll see lots of onyms in onomastics, as everybody knows. You'll find a whole range of things like tonyms, hydronyms, theonyms, gyneconyms, chromatonyms, and so forth. It's not true that names entail a particular category. As I have to demonstrate, of course it's true that Austria is the name of a certain country. Of course it's true that Mary is the name of certain individual women, but that does not make them categorially a toponym or a gyneconym, effectively. Consider this. I had long known the name Sydney. The first occurrence of Sydney that I knew was a bit of that name, the first name, the given name of a boy at my primary school. So I've known him from the age of 5 onwards. That was quite a long time ago, but I still maintain the recollection. Sydney then might be thought of as a male given name, but it's also a surname. You can look in the Oxford Dictionary that Cal referred to if you want to check that out. And possibly more familiarly than both of those facts is that Sydney is a place name, the largest city in Australia. There's a relationship between these, of course, but I didn't know that when I knew my friend Sydney at the age of 5. The male given name, historically, is derived from the surname. The place name also derived from the surname. The surname comes first, historic. So how do we categorize Sydney? Do we drop it into 3 categories and synchronically, at least, offer a relationship between them? That seems at least one potential solution. But is it primarily more one than the other? I think we don't know. George Washington is, of course, the first president of the United States, but is also the name of many other people as well. Perhaps more Black Americans bear the name George Washington than white Americans. The name is also borne by a well-known racehorse. If I don't happen to know many people called George Washington, then is George Washington a racehorse name for me? Is that the category to which I assign it? Or do we have to depend on some more abstract, some more widespread, some more general knowledge than I as an individual might have access to? My favorite one that I've used in lectures like this on the occasions before, apologies if you've heard before, relates to the Peaks Tunnel. Now, if you were a live audience, I would ask you, I would stare at you intently and say, come on then, what sort of a thing do you think Peak Tunnel is? I think many of you might be silent because you would sense a trap correctly, because Peaks Tunnel was the name in my hometown of a perfectly ordinary railway bridge. It wasn't a tunnel at all, but nevertheless, it was always known as Peaks Tunnel. So how transparent the name, however well-known name, there are reasons for thinking that simply assigning it to a particular category of onym is not the right approach. Names carry expectations. Of course, I would expect George Washington to be a male human being until evidence was presented otherwise, but there's no guarantee that the bearer of that name or any other is actually a member of one onomastic category or not. Okay, what a name denotes in everyday linguistic usage for any individual person depends on that user's own experience of them. So if you meet a city and you only know the place name in Australia, then you will simply Sydney defined I guess, in mental lexicon, if you wish to categorize it, as a place name, and you will need to add at some future time the idea to give you a surname or a male given name as well. Another take on sense is that, following some philosophers, you might judge the sense of a name to be the set of attributes of their bearers, either singly or collectively, what I think it was Bertrand Russell first called their descriptive backup. If so, Nelson might mean, if you'll bear with me and just assume only one person has ever been called Nelson, which is of course entirely false, but the most famous Nelson was a British sea lord. He was born in Burnethorpe. He was an admiral. He was blind one eye. He was notoriously the lover of a lady called Emma Hamilton. He won 2 famous battles, Copenhagen and Trafalgar, which tends to be all the contribution of the sailors, but nevertheless it's said that he won the battle, and he's commemorated by a famous column in London. If we say that a name is equated with backup, then that runs us into logical difficulties. We're not dealing with the sense of a term fully understood. If I say that a tiger is characterized by stripes, that's definitionally true. If I say that Nelson is commemorated by a column in London, that happens to be true, but it can hardly be a definition of Nelson, because one can easily envisage a world in which no column was ever erected. One cannot, if we're dealing with normality, envisage a tiger without stripes. So if we talk about sense of the sort involving tigers and stripes, then it's not the same relationship that we're dealing with between Nelson and a column in London. The only indisputable logical property of a sentence including Nelson is that an individual with that name existed. Not necessarily even an individual person, but an individual. That's known, of course, as you all know, as the presupposition of existence. But the identification that the name might denote comes through encyclopedic knowledge. That is knowledge of facts, not of sense relations. And that's the only way of further specifying the meaning of a sentence that includes the name. That knowledge can't be entailed, since in the real world it could have been otherwise. Knowledge of that fact is contingent. So my conclusion at this preliminary point in the talk is that even the most transparent names have no sense as definable in logically based semantics. Their etymological meanings may be transparent, but that's the same thing. If I say Newcastle is not a new castle, then you can accuse me of contradicting myself, and I'll accept that. If I say Newcastle isn't a Newcastle, that's not contradiction, and by all the implications. If you're with me so far, and I'm afraid since I can't see my audience, I'll have to assume that you believe me so far. If names have no sense, if you have followed me, what are they? How do they perform what job? The foundational point for me is that expressions whose job is to identify an individual and to refer to an individual. Don't do this, as you'll now predict I'm going to say, virtue of any sense of the words that appear in them may appear to have, but in virtue only of a link between the name and the thing name, which has evolved over time, has become conventional, and has become replicated in repeated use. The idea, in fact, that was first put on a full basis by Saul Kripke in his work, of which the second edition appeared in 1980, and which he called rigid designation, set up the idea that a link between a name and what it denotes is true in all possible worlds. Names have, for me then, one of their principal jobs, picking out individuals in context. That is, referring to individuals efficiently, necessarily uniquely. It doesn't always work. If I were to refer to Carol now, you would assume that I'm the visible Carol on your screen. Okay, but of course it's perfectly possible that there might be 2 Carol in a room. And I might, in speaking of Carol, I'd simply cause confusion among my listeners until I specified which Carol by surname. So the job of a name is to make a reasonable stab of referring to an individual in a particular context. It may not be totally accurate this time round, but it'll probably do the job with a short amount of correction. So an understanding of the fundamental nature of names lies in reference to individuals, a human activity, rather than in denotation of individuals, which is a linguistic property allocated to names by the first philosophers of language in the Greek linguistic tradition, which is why early discussions of proper names tended to focus on names for which there was only one well-known bearer in antiquity, for example, Cicero, say, or a place name like Sparta. Since there was only one saint member of each of those categories, it was quite easy to fall into the trap of believing that names denoted particular individuals. So with individual denoting, which I think is problematic, we return to the multiple bearer problem, remembering George Washington, for which there are many examples. If names denote unique individuals, which they don't, why are there so many individuals with linguistically identical names? It's perfectly obvious, surely, and I surely don't need to labour this, that names don't have the property of denoting unique individuals unless all instances of a particular name, for example, Richard, are akin to be distinct and therefore homonyms. That's just weird. I mean, if my father's name had been Richard, and if I had been named after him, which would no doubt have been the case, then surely we don't have names which just happen to be homonymous. Somebody has given me the same name as my father by all reasonable anthropological standards. It's not a logical problem at all. It's the same name. The key to an alternative view of names that I want to expound is provided precisely those names which appear to be transparent and which therefore appear to be sense-bearing, like the University of the West of England. Names like the White House, the Southern Ocean, or the Glorious Revolution. For those who are not versed in English history, I should just point out that the Glorious Revolution was a series of historical events in 1688, by which James II was removed from the throne and King William III and Queen Mary came to the throne. But one revolution in British history is referred to as the Glorious Revolution, hence the capital letters. These are names which have evolved out of fully sense-bearing expressions, of course. And that's symbolized by the addition of capital letters, I suppose. That's an English matter. Of course, there are languages which don't trade in capital letters in the same way. There's plenty of place name evidence, for example, that names evolve from fully grammaticalized expression in the same sort of way. Just in a very simple example, the place name Hendon, a suburb of London, clearly means, or clearly meant in Old English, at the high hill, philological reasons which I could specify, but don't need to here. What we have is evidence of an oldish definite dative locative noun phrase, which of course you don't need to know if you're simply getting on the London Underground and getting out at Hendon Tube Station, and it will probably never occur to you. But the key is you have fully sense-bearing expressions and they become names through the loss of that sense-bearing material. It's necessary to believe that many names were fully senseful on coining, like the ones I've just mentioned, because that's the reason why they were coined in the first place. And we wouldn't be historical toponymasts if we didn't believe that. We go into the job believing that names are explainable out of historical vocabulary and historical grammar. Just as a kind of side note at this point, of course, it's possible for a name to be invented out of the blue. If I could get away with calling a Newsman blah, 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 then that would be his name if you were to buy that. And that would not be assignable to a lexical, grammatical English expression. But names such as that are an overwhelming, or perhaps even underwhelming, minority in English. The majority, of course, evolve out of meaning material. So names not only lose all relevance to their pre-nomination sense, by definition in my book, they persist through changed circumstances, or may do, which make them inappropriate. Newcastle, for example, no longer has a salient castle, particularly if I mean the Newcastle in Monmouthshire, which has no castle that I've been able to detect. Berwickshire, a county of Scotland, is named from the city of Berwick, which is no longer in Berwickshire, because it was stolen from the Scots in the 15th century, though I'm subject to question on that one. Aberystwyth is a name of a Welsh town, which means the mouth of the river Ystwyth. Since it was named, the river Ystwyth changed its course and left Aberystwyth high and dry. But in none of these cases were the names changed. Okay, the fact that they were no longer relevant to their settings was of no possible consequence to their efficiency as place names. So census is just one of those things that it's part of the job of being a place name. So crucially, some expressions may be either transitionally or in relation to different preference, at the same time both sense-bearing and therefore not be names, and same time senseless and therefore be names. Theoretically, a user might fluctuate in their usage, sometimes using the names, the expression sensefully and sometimes not. Or if there are two different users of language in the same place at the same time, one may be treating an expression as a name and the other not. What's critical is the outcome in the longer run. If you were with me on the last slide, you'll immediately be asking the question, how can we tell what a user, by which I mean either a speaker or a writer, is doing when they're using an ambiguous expression? I can give you a preparatory answer to that, but it's one that I'll return to more fully at the end of the talk, if you'll bear with me. A partial justification of what I'm saying is seen in considering the first example on this slide. I visited the White House without capital letters versus I visited the White House with capital letters. If you say this, you're committed to the entailed truth of I visited the house which is white in the left-hand case, or you're not in the right case. In the latter case, you're using a proper name, just identifying and labeling a particular spot. For example, the place where the US president lives, though I've known many other White Houses as well. I happen to pick on the most salient one. Okay, so the one without capital letters entails the truth of the proposition in the third bullet point. The one with capital letters entails absolutely no such thing. Because, of course, I could paint the White House a different color if I felt like it, and had the money, time, and could get past the security guards. It wouldn't affect necessarily its being called the White House. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 is so called because that's what it was called by historians of a Whig persuasion in the 18th century, and the name has stuck. Of course, it's possible to have an alternative view on the deposition of King James II, and people who believe that the Glorious Revolution is an inglorious revolution, and come to be viewed as a bad thing. That doesn't mean that Glorious Revolution comes to be useless as a name. It might stick in the throat for some user, but it might still serve as a name. So my interim generalized conclusion definition of namehood, properhood, is that names must lose sense. It's part of their definition. They're named, they lose sense either when they're coined. So if I apply the word Daisy as a given name to a female baby, it no longer becomes directly semantically relevant that it's a flower name. It just becomes called Daisy, it's her name, and that's that. Fully fledged expressions like the Newcastle and the King's Wood may evolve into becoming a name. Transparently, the etymology may remain accessible for us as long as that transparency remains, though they are not used sensefully in ordinary usage. So underlined, you'll see at the bottom of this slide, a name is any expression which is used to refer to an individual senselessly, not expression which denotes an individual senselessly or otherwise. Richard is a name because it has no sense. Please don't misinterpret that. Please don't read that as having said Richard has no sense. Please remember that it appears in italics at this point, and referring to the name rather than the bearer. Richard is not interpretable lexically, so its denotation is a matter of contingent fact. It happens to include me. Newcastle is a name despite having to appear despite appearing to have sense, because interpreting lexically is pragmatically irrelevant. Its denotation is a matter of contingent fact. It happens to include place on the Tyne and a place in Monmouthshire that I referred to a few slides ago. And the same applies to the White House. It has transparent etymology that it wears on its sleeve, but the notion of castleness is not invoked when you refer to the city. Okay, I'll allow you to pause for a breath if you wish. I'm going to have a drink, excuse me. I have a few more slides left. Some of the material that follows in it may be a little bit repetitive, but that's largely for rhetorical reasons. I want to just sit in your minds to make concrete the position that I've taken so far, in the hope that you won't disagree with me too harshly. Okay, turning to the question of whether properhood is a structural characteristic, that is, whether an expression is either a name or not a name. It's a name that's notion that's rendered the understanding of properhood very difficult. The notion that names are essentially nouns to start with in Greek and then Latin theory, and that nouns are either proper, like Cicero, or common, like teapot, of course means, as I said earlier, that being proper is an inherent or structural feature of certain lexemes. That's a problem if you interpret it rigidly. For example, it implies that some frontal names are not names, just like the Glorious Revolution, the White House, the Tropic of Cancer, and so forth, or even the High Street in those towns which have a high street. The problem can be eliminated altogether if it can be shown that properhood is a structural category at all. I've already hinted, and as I'll demonstrate later. The position I've outlined in this talk suggests that names best understood as referring expressions, primarily and above all, and that properhood in itself is a mode of reference rather than a structural category. That's a slogan, if you like. If we like, we can say any expression that's used only to refer senselessly is a proper name, whether it's a noun or a phrase, that it only denotes certain individuals, or it has no lexical existence. In which case, you could view proper name as being a structural category with a membership that includes all and only those expressions that are used to refer senselessly. In other words, it's epiphenomenal on the notion of senseless reference, and you don't need it. Sense reference comes first. You don't need the category of proper names as a structural category. So properhood is a mode of referring, picking out an individual in context using words senselessly, that is, without commitment to entails that would normally follow from them. A proper name is an expression that does that. Excuse me if I stop a bit. I'm aware that time is going on. I may have tried to drop upon you something that you may not have wished to hear, namely that names don't consist of a category that's delimitable of proper nouns or of anything else. It's my contention that all linguistic expressions may be used onymically, may be used namely, if I can put it that way. I'm a linguist. I'm permitted to invent a word if I want to, please. So namely means in the manner of a name. In the next bullet point there, you can see some proper names. Hail Pirates looks like an English verb phrase, possibly an imperative, which is, however, best known as the name of a famous racehorse. Driven to Tears is also the name of a racehorse. You're beginning to spot something here, I'm sure. On Cloud 9 is a sentence, and it's also the name of a racehorse. Just to throw something different into the mix, Tallulah does the hula from Hawaii, I may have mentioned on other occasions before, was the name bestowed on an unfortunate child in New Zealand by an overzealous parent. Lawyers the parent to court to try and get the idea that this was the child's name overturned. And perhaps fortunately the child, depending on your cultural prejudices, the court won, and the child is now known as something else, which is probably now private information. But Tallulah does the hula from Hawaii was undoubtedly a name because it's bestowed as a name, and it was attempted to be registered formally. You don't need to go to such exotic places as racehorses' names or bizarre attempts to bestow a given name. In some cultures, perfectly normal for a name to consist of a phrase which effectively is unstructured insofar as its use as a name goes. In Yoruba, you get such names as Batunde, which means father returns, literally, if it were used as expression of the language. But a name, of course, you don't have to access the notion of father returning every time you refer to a person with this name, or every time you have to fill in a form in which you have to enter your own name, Babatunde. The idea of father returning is relevant to those contexts. Okay, I could say feel free to go now, and if this was a spoken in-person version of the talk, of course you might leave the room, but you're able to leave the room at any time during the talk, and if you feel free to go, you've probably already on if you wanted to, but thank you for listening. There is a little bit more I'd like to go on to. If you like, I shan't mind if you go. So a misunderstanding has taken place in some quarters about what TPTP does claim. Of course, TPTP does not claim that names are meaningless. They're centrally involved with the meaningful act of reference. They have, even if it's a second order phenomenon, denotations in the form of extensions, a list of things which are attached to what is named. They may lack sense, but etymologies may be transparent and relevantly accessed. In other words, to answer questions like, why is Newcastle called Newcastle? Why did you call your daughter Daisy? And so forth, though not in order for those names to perform reference. And of course, names have connotations of an enormous variety. Those are all ways in which names are meaningful. The final thing, if you're still with me, I think a few people will be there still, is the final thing I'd like to do is just run through, I think, the strengths and weaknesses of TPT. The strengths, I will state what I think are the positives first of all, what names actually do, their devices for nomination, that is labeling, the forming of a more or less permanent association, a Kripkean kind, between a linguistic form and an individual, whether the name is actually bestowed on an individual, as with baptism, or where it evolves, as with certain place names, from a fully linguistic articulated expression. Second function of names is to achieve efficient vocation, that is saying, Carol, you see, I've just done it. I've alerted Carol and Samantha. Sorry, I've stood you down immediately. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, they're devices for efficient reference. It's the critical and definitional thing that names are involved in. The strengths of these ideas that I've propounded during the talk is that the notion name can finally be detached from the notion noun. We may think of proper nouns as the prototypical names, but they're just one special sort of names which are highly linguistically variable in their properties. We have a clear distinction between sense, which is active in conversation or written linguistic usage, It's clearly distinct from etymological meaning, which can be recovered for a whole range of purposes, provided that the form remains transparent. Properhood emerges through referential usage in real situations. Usage alone, speaking or writing, establishes a name's dictatum through repeated referential acts. And names then finally are defined not by what they denote, but by how they're used. What they denote follows from that. The last thing I'm going to mention is what I think may be regarded as a weakness of TPTP. As you will see, I think that although I can't offer tangible experimental proof of what I'm about to say, you see the broad outlines of how I might counter the weakness. How can you tell whether a user is using a transparent expression like the White House senselessly or sensefully? Because you'll have noticed that that differentiation is absolutely critical to what I've had to say. I think an in principle answer is possible, summarized by this diagram. If you have an expression which can either be a name or a non-name, let's say the White House, for sake of argument, if a name, using the White House takes you directly to the referent, calls up the referent directly. If you're using it not as a name, then getting to the referent involves mediation by the sense of the words the, white, and house. Now you can see that since that's a set of cognitive operations, that it ought to be subject to the constraints of the machine that is operating the cognitive process, namely the brain. Okay, so in principle, to recover the referent of an expression that isn't a name ought to take longer than recovering the referent expression which is a name, because it's a two-stage process rather than a one-stage process. So in principle, if the expressions are phonologically identical, the difference in interpretation could be computable in reaction time experiments, though I fully concede that experimental design might be a problem. I'm not an active psycholinguist. If one is listening and wishes to elaborate with me on this and has a better sense of how an experiment might be structured than I do, please let me know, online or offline. So senseless referring should take less time than senseful referring. Established for suitor primed, that's a fact that was established for suitably primed, non-ambiguous referring expressions 150 years ago by the Dutch psychologist F.G. Donders. Okay, that concludes my talk. I've mentioned only a few people. Vanity made me mention myself, and I draw your attention to my what I think is my foundational article in language in 2006. I've mentioned Saul Kripke, and I've mentioned John Stuart Mill. I can provide a full list of other references to anybody who might be interested. Thank you very much indeed for listening, hearing me out, and I submit myself to mercy.
Richard, thank you very much indeed for an absolutely fantastic lecture. You've given us all a huge amount to think about, and we now do have some time for questions. I would invite anyone with a question to ask either to raise a virtual hand using the reaction button, or just type the word question into the chat and I'll invite you to ask it. We do already have one question from Vladislav in the chat. Vladislav, would you like to unmute and ask your question, or would you prefer me to read it out?
If possible, to read it out.
You prefer me to read it out? Okay. So
Hello,
the
Vlad.
question, sorry. Yeah.
I was reading
Sorry,
Richard, very good to see you.
I'm reading it in the comments.
Yeah, I'll read it out for the benefit of anyone
Okay.
who's perhaps watching the lecture online. Vladislav says, Richard, thank you very much for your very interesting, inspiring and insightful lecture. I've got a question. In light of cognitive semantics, how relevant remains the distinction between sense and encyclopedic knowledge? Both appear to be forms of information, content, and to be easily mutually convertible. Also, if we think of mental spaces, can we look on reference and denotation as roughly the same process or close processes? A lot there.
Thank you very much indeed. There's a profound point in there. In fact, there are 2 points. One of them is, I think, easy to answer. The other one is not. So let's take the easy one first. Can we look on reference and denotation as roughly the same process or close processes? I think there's a straightforward answer to that, which is no. Denotation, in the way defined it, is not a process. Reference is a process. It's what happened in the real world. Denotation is the abstract link which is formed by repeated acts of reference in mind between a thing, an individual, and the expression which represents it in some way. But the other point is extremely profound and difficult, I think. How relevant remains the distinction between sense and encyclopedic knowledge? The only defense I have to acknowledging that there is a problem there, the only thing I can say is that I'm using sense in the way in which it's generally used by linguists, where the whole idea of sense is underpinned by the idea of formal logic. So that, for example, synonyms are underpinned by the logical notion of equivalence, antonyms are underpinned by the logical notion of negation and such like. I think there's a fundamental difference between those aspects of between those relationships and encyclopedic knowledge, which are individualized items of knowledge attaching to an expression. I simply want to maintain that distinction on the basis that that's the way that they've traditionally been conceived in philosophy and in linguistics. I think as far as the way real people operate with ideas in conversational terms, I think there's work to be done, and there's work to understanding how they interrelate. And I'm afraid I can't give a more profound answer than that. But it's an extremely good question, and one which I have to bear in mind.
Thanks, Richard. Any more questions? Either raise a virtual hand because I can't see you all on my screen, or just unmute and speak if you'd prefer, or type in the chat. While we're waiting, could I just ask not a very good question, but quite a trivial question, really. I've been pondering about your example of the University of the Third Age, which, as you say, doesn't refer to a university, but does it nonetheless depend on sense, in that it depends on subverting the sense? I'm thinking, interpreting it lexically could be pragmatically relevant, or isn't it?
It's pragmatically relevant because it depends on a trope, and tropes are practically relevant. It's a metaphor, yeah? And so if I speak of the University of the Third Age, which, just to remind listeners, is a kind of adult educational institution rather than a formal university, as you say, it depends on pointing at similarities, the metaphorical similarities between this institution and universities defined as such. Yes, of course, it's pragmatically relevant to look at the etymology of University of the Third Age and compare it the etymology of other universities by title. Okay, but in speaking of the University of Third Age, since that's name, okay, then I'm not committed. If I say I'm going to lecture to the University of the Third Age tonight, it doesn't commit me logically to the idea that I'm going to lecture a university. or indeed it does commit me to the idea that there might not be some young people there, because you know, the university of the third age means childhood, adulthood, retirement. Basically, the third age is retirement. I put it in that charitable way rather than old age. Okay, so the university of the third age is post work experience, if you like. So the University of the Third Age is its name, and it's subject to exactly the same constraints as the University of anywhere else by title.
So yes, thanks very much. So yes, and you mentioned metaphor, which was something else I was wondering about a bit, because I understand your point that names have no sense relations, by which I assume you mean synonymy, antonymy, and a hyponymy.
Exactly.
And
yes.
later on, you also ruled out homonymy. Do you find the notion of polysemy useful?
I sense a question.
I possibly haven't put that very well, but you know, I am thinking about.
I mean, I don't mind trick questions. It's the
Yeah.
speaker is fair for a trick
no,
question.
it's not a trick question at all. It is something I'm pondering in my mind.
Yeah. Homonyms, it's not a semantic relation, a homonymy. Homonyms are simply words of different meaning, or expressions of different meaning, which sound the same or look the same in writing. So it's not a semantic relation at all. It's a form relation. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it's often discussed alongside sense relations, but yes, indeed.
So polysemy is a sense relation, and it's one that depends crucially, it seems to me, on tropes. If a word has more than one meaning, and those meanings are not simply homonymous, accidental in a way, then the key to the definition of polysemy lies in tropes. Words have more than one meaning because, for example, the older meaning and the newer meaning are related by metaphor, by metonymy, by technological advance, in the way that you know, words like fell have been updated from being a physical paper or cardboard entity to something which corresponds in software terms and so forth. So yes, words like that are related by polysemy, but I can't see polysemy is a useful concept in names, because let's take a straightforward example. You have a place name Cambridge in England, you have a place in Cambridge in Massachusetts, so, and it's not clear that polysemy is the relationship which links them. Clearly one was named after the other, but in being so named, newer one simply takes on an embodiment all of its own. Works perfectly okay without any history, as it were. It's just a place called Cambridge. And if you don't know the one in England, only know the one in Massachusetts, then any question of transfer of the place name becomes irrelevant to processing in the context of the here and now.
Yeah,
so I'm not sure polysemy fits in.
That's fair enough. Yeah,
I can't see scope for it in onomastics.
Thanks very much. Other questions? Anyone? I don't see any. No. In that case, I think we simply thank Richard again for a really, really wonderful lecture, which has brought this session of the ICOS series to a really terrific close. So thank you again, Richard. I invite people to clap using the reactions button, as I'm doing myself. And I'll just hand over to Catalina in case you have any concluding remarks. Catalina.
In the meantime, thank you for patience, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this fascinating lecture. It was a perfect talk to close this semester, I think. So thank you very much indeed. And I also would like to show my screen. Is it possible?
I think you'll have to stop sharing, won't you, Richard, to let Kathleen do
Yeah,
that.
maybe.
Yes, sorry. Sorry, I'm trying not to green share, honestly. There we go. Okay.
That's it.
Okay,
Brilliant.
thank you. And yeah, so I am very happy that I can show you the rich program of the autumn semester. We will have at least 3 speakers. Elvis De Stefani is going to give a talk on the origins, aims, and methods of interactional onomastics with the title Speaking with Names in September. And then in October, Carol Harth is going to deal with metaphor and metonymy in names. And then in November, Rita Burdar-Sabo and Mario Burdar are going to continue this topic with a lecture titled Anthroponymy, More Metaphor and Metonymy Than Meets the Eye. Please mark these dates in your calendar. And as always, you can find more information about the program of ICOS at ICOS website. So that's all. Have a nice holiday and see you in September. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
I just got time to say thank you to the ICOS committee for instituting this series.
Thank you.